Thank you, Nancy. I put my camera on momentarily because I'll share my screen in a moment, but I just wanted to give people an updated view because I failed to give you an updated picture. I looked at your splash screen picture of me and realized I really should have given you an updated picture. Sorry about that.
I don't know about that. Sometimes those driver's licenses 10 years ago look pretty good.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I'm going to stop my video and we're going to take a 10-second pause here so I can get my screen oriented. So please bear with me one moment.
Also, while Mark is doing that, just a reminder that, again, we are happy to accept questions in the chat area. So if you want to post a written question, you can set it up there. We're also paused throughout the presentation to accept questions verbally. So Mark will pause at certain points to feel free to sort of get those questions in if you want to post them in the chat, or be prepared when he pauses his question as he goes along.
So Brian, can you just see the main screen, or can you see my?
We are great. Yep, we are seeing exactly what you want us to see.
Great. So a word about the talk I'm going to give. I gave a version of this. I don't remember how many years ago it was, Nancy, at Meadowbrook a long time ago, and it's evolved over time, but it serves as a basis, a broad overview of the basics of archives. We use it in our Save Michigan History program, which I'll mention in a moment, and hopefully will give either a good reminder or a good refresher or a good foundation for any of you, in addition to the deeper dive presentations that are going to come in the following week. So you'll see a couple of slides that actually won't go into depth that the future presentations will. So why don't we get started? And as Brian said, I'm going to pause throughout so we can have, I really want to try to keep this as informal as possible because it is online, and rather than me talking the entire time, I'd like to interact a little bit. So I have some slides built in after each section to stop and take any questions you might have, and then we'll also have general questions at the end. So a few overview notes about the Archives of Michigan, where I've worked since, it's almost 23 years now, hard to believe. And I just want to make sure, if you're not familiar with the archives, we are part of the Michigan History Center, which is in Lansing and also includes the Michigan History Museum and the 10 historic sites around the state that are part of that system. We've been around officially since 1913 and renewed our legislation in 2016. Our main function is to assist state and local government units with records preservation. And we also have a public reading room that's open normally. Oh, I added this to my slide. We're normally open to the public 6 days a week, but currently due to COVID, what we're doing differently now is doing virtual reference interviews via Zoom. So you can contact us and sign up for a one-on-one video chat with one of our archivists to discuss research questions or needs. And then we also have the ability to fill requests remotely as well. So that's a poor substitute for being able to have people in person, but it's better than just being completely close to the public. And that reference has been growing. We're located in downtown Lansing. And if you've never been there, once we reopen, we invite you to join us. So the archives, again, is official repository for the state of Michigan for government records. We also have a number of governor-appointed boards. The one I'm responsible for is the Michigan State Historical Records Advisory Board, which is a mouthful. We usually use the acronym, which is the MSHRAB, which isn't really that much easier, come to think of it. But the purpose of this board is to work to encourage records preservation with organizations around the state. It's been around since the mid-70s, and I think, depending on the year, it's ebbed and flowed as far as its efficacy. And one of the things I'm really trying to do is to build this function of this board up, and the effectiveness of this board up to a level higher than it's been in the last 10, 15 years. And that really means working out with smaller historical organizations to get them the education and the tools and the resources that they need. Now, we don't have millions of dollars. We have small amounts of money, but it's really important to us to be an advocate statewide for records preservation and access. So you can see from the slide, we work to help people have preservation and access. Our connection with the federal government is through the National Historical Publications and Records Commission. They're an adjunct to the National Archives. And specifically, we run what's called the Save Michigan History Program. We rebranded this program about 4 years ago, and
2 down, 1 to go.
And up till this point, up till COVID, we've
Somebody in the Red Wings locker room.
I'm gonna just pause and remind people to mute themselves. Although the Red Wings locker room is a great background. We've been building this, and COVID sort of stopped us in our tracks, but we're trying to get it restarted again right now. Through the program, we offer the basics of archives workshops. Usually those were done on in person because they're more effective. We offer on-site assessments, and what that meant is we would send an archivist out to an organization and basically have them do a top to bottom health check for the organization, considering a lot of things we're going to talk about today. And then after you receive that assessment, you would have an opportunity to apply for some re-grant funding after the assessment was completed. So we can talk more about that later, but that's an important program, that board function. That's the main function of that Historical Records Advisory Board. It's the Save Michigan History Program. So let's jump into it. And again, at the beginning I said, this may be a refresher or an overview for you. It's not meant to seem remedial. So if there's some stuff here that you already know, just you can nod your head, and hopefully there's some things that you don't know, and we're just going to walk through and cover that. One of the things I think is easy to forget, especially in a mixed collection organization, is how do you apply the term archival? And how we apply it is it's for a unique, one-of-a-kind primary source item. It's not an artifact, and it can cover a wide range of formats, including born digital. We can talk about that a little bit later. And we treat it differently than you would a publication, something that, even I think maps are the gray area here, but books and pamphlets and serial, magazines, etc. We treat these different. And so I just want to make sure we have that basic definition moving forward, that we treat that as, we treat primary resource documents as one-of-a-kind originals that you can't get anywhere else. I have a little note here about public records. I'm going to save that for later. So these are all the various sections that we're going to walk through, and they're aspects of what we call archival practice. All 6 of these have some direct correlation to preservation, and I know we have a section actually called preservation, but I think you'll appreciate what I'm getting at as we move through here. Without appraisal, you can't preserve documents. The same for arrangement, description, reference and access, digitization, and so forth. So the first section we want to talk about is appraisal and collecting. And I think one of the things that is a big challenge for a lot of organizations is whether or not you have a collecting policy. This is one of those foundational documents that that every organization should have, and probably needs to look at on a regular basis. It can define what to collect and what not to collect, and also define when it would be appropriate to deaccession material or remove it from the collection. I think it also helps you avoid competing with other institutions, or at least give you the ability to have a discussion on how to handle collecting when you're collecting in a similar path as another institution. So components for writing a collecting policy are really considering your resources. What do you have capacity to care and provide for? I know in my experience, there have been times when collections that aren't automatically sent to the Archives of Michigan have been presented to us, and we really have to scrutinize whether it's in scope with our collecting policy, but even if it is, if it's something that we could manage or take care of long term, those are difficult decisions to make, because if you're like me, when it comes to preserving history, I'm usually let's preserve it now and figure out how to do it later, which, that's okay in some respects, but I think it's really important to address capacity up front, and that includes formats. Can you really afford to take 100,000 or 2-3 terabytes of digital information, or if it's an actual physical collection, do you have space for it as well? And even if it's important historically, does it really match the rest of your collections and how or why people do research in your collections? So lots of things to consider there. This is really, this slide's meant to be a real bulleted list of what you would include in a collecting policy. Some obvious things like organization and program name, but your purpose. Do you have a mission statement? And if not, really working on that mission statement precedes a collecting policy. The collecting emphasis, the different types of formats that you're willing to take. And when I say formats, I'm really saying you need to decide between physical and digital or both. Do you have an acquisition process? And if so, is it documented? And the same goes for removal process or a loan process. And in general, for our institution, we do not do loans very often. It's more the exception than the rule, and we don't encourage it because it includes things like needing to have insurance, but I understand that there are organizations that's part of their normal business. Just make sure you have the steps of that process documented, and it's not just a handshake agreement, obviously. So again, really important to have a collecting policy and make sure you're addressing issues like capacity. And I think reviewing this every 2 to 4 years, just reevaluating the collecting policy, because your capacity changes over those times. I wanted to pause here and see if we had any questions. Like I said, I'm going to stop after each section just to. Does everybody have collecting policies in place already? Looks like we have about 30 some participants here today. Right, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how we're addressing questions, if they're coming through chat or whatever. I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you are able to, please, you can go ahead and unmute for this moment. So if you have a question, you can ask Mark directly. You can also post in the chat. I did have some that came in, but they're not particularly about having a collecting policy. I know that there are a few folks on the line who are representing some of our museum partners, and I would love for them to chime in, because this is your chance. You've got access to the state's archivist to ask those particular questions. But so this is your opportunity. Keep moving. Go ahead, Nancy.
So, when we're talking about a lot of collections at a very local level, you know, often, if you want to say it, these organizations might be a part of a municipal government or other entities who may or may not be self-insured, and that's sort of the risk that you might be taking in the collection. So I guess basically the collecting policy is all your eyes are open in terms of what you're doing. But do you have any suggestions as to how, you know, people with limited budgets and things like that might want to think about their collecting? And
Well, I guess going back to the Save Michigan History program, getting help developing a collection policy is something that that program is there to help address. So if there are organizations out there that are acknowledging, yes, I know we need a collecting policy, but we don't really know where to start, or we don't know how to address some of our capacity issues, connecting with the board would be a good first step. So we wouldn't sit down and write it for you because we don't know the institution like the members do, but we could certainly help facilitate that.
So we do have a question. Roger Luxick, who was one of our friends that I was talking about from the Packard Proving Grounds. Is there a standard policy and procedure for access by researchers to primary source documents and photos, fees to be charged? So this is more about, I guess, you know, what you do after you built that collection. So maybe we want to table that until a little
Yeah,
bit.
we'll talk about that in the reference and access section.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
So Roger, we've got a pin in it. We'll come back to it. I have another one about that as well. So
Okay. All right. So let's move ahead then and talk about the second half of appraisal in collecting, which is appraising archival records. So defined appraisals, the analysis of historic, legal, fiscal, or intrinsic value of a group of records and their relationship to other records based on the organization's collecting policy. So it's really hard. You can't appraise without that collecting policy. So in short, it's, should we keep this material and why? So that's the focus of appraising. And I think it really is important to develop that collecting policy so it feeds into your appraisal. And you can see the bullet points I have here: when and why, when and where the records were created matters. What type of information is it? Is it evidential? Is it informational? Is it legal? Who created them? Does that relate to your organization's collecting policy? How do the records fit into the program? And how are you determining value? And if the material isn't suitable for your institution, we always suggest you try to help the donor find another option. When someone comes to us to donate records and they're not a fit or they're not archival, I never want to just say, nope, sorry, we don't take that. We always try to offer other options, because chances are, whether it's another historical organization or a library or what have you, we want to be able to give people options. Are there some times when that's just not possible? Yes, but it's usually not the case. We usually can come up with some options for donors. Examples of some non-records are, in this first one, we could probably start a heated debate of whether financial ledgers are non-records or not. So here's my take on financial ledgers as records or non-records. And by non-records, I mean something that's not archival or doesn't have informational value. If the financial ledger is purely numerical and is not tied to some sort of historic interpretation, then I would say that they're non-record. We took a private collection in recently that had lots of financial ledgers, but they showed the different rise of the different production outputs and price changes in a particular commodity. So to me, for a researcher, that's going to have value. Simple receipts, supply orders, duplicate material, those are all non-records. Published material, we call it a non-record in that definition of a primary resource. Doesn't mean you shouldn't keep it, but again, with published material, from an archival perspective, you really need to make that value decision of whether it's worth taking a square inch of your shelf up for material that could be available somewhere else. And I understand the arguments about convenience, etc. But if your shelves are full and 20-30% is filled with published material that people could find somewhere else, or there's multiple copies, or there's copies online, I mean, you're really sacrificing space for future primary resource collections. It's a really tough decision, because a lot of times those materials augment the original material that you have in your collection. But it's just something to consider when you're appraising, and really challenge yourself whether you need that material or not. Okay, so this is another quick stop for appraisal questions.
Mark, we also had a question that I think fits into this area. Bill Greenwood had asked a question about examples of items you no longer collect and why. And I think that's what you were kind of trying to explain in those last few slides, is sometimes things you get duplicate materials or materials that didn't necessarily need to be archived in the most in the more traditional sense. So Bill, hopefully that answers your question, or at least he showed some examples. But maybe Mark, do you have any other thoughts of, based on what you just explained, some things that you shy away from, or things that people bring that you might, even though your heart says gimme, the reality says you can't accept everything.
Yeah, I think here's some recent examples of things that come into us that, personally, I mean, let's be honest, anything that is old or historic is hard for me to say, yeah, no, we don't want to keep that. And I think ledgers, especially, if you see ledgers from 1860 and the old leather bound, covers, and they just look historic as they are. But sometimes they're just blank, or they're filled with that financial information. To me, that's one of the big heartstring ones that you really need to challenge yourself on. But postcards, we get so many postcards. And postcards are, I mean, I don't know how many exceptions there are with, if someone gave you a postcard and you could look at it and really be sure, wow, that's the only one, that's the only copy of that postcard that exists. I mean, there are some really rare ones out there, but we do collect postcards, but I would say in the last few years, we've really shied away from them because we have so many. There are copyright issues embedded in postcards, but again, they're pretty, and they're sort of like a map. They're published, but if they're the only one left, then they sort of revert to becoming the primary document, even though they're published. And those usually fall into a duplicate material category as well. We probably have, I know we've taken in postcards where we have duplicates of them, so we want to be careful not to do that. Hopefully that answers that question.
I'm sure there are many, sort of case-by-case examples, but he was looking for, some examples of items no longer collected and why. I think there are others, archives and collections that I know I've interacted with that run into this same issue, whether it's physical space or duplication, or sort of mission bleed into other areas that maybe they shouldn't be working on. So they have to keep sort of focused on.
Yeah, I think another good example probably is when a collection comes to an organization and it's a mixture of archival and artifactual materials. Not every organization is equipped to deal with one or the other. So you might have some more purely archival organizations taking on artifacts and not really knowing what to do with them, or more traditional museum institutions taking on archival materials and not probably having the bandwidth to deal with those and provide the access to them. Because traditional archives are built more on access to researchers and research materials, whereas a museum is built more for exhibition. And so it's probably harder for a museum to have a research space, and it's probably harder for an archives do exhibits. So I think that's another, for the Archives of Michigan, we have the luxury of being part of the History Center, which includes the museum. So when a collection comes to us that fits our collecting policy, and we have appraised it to be acceptable, and it has artifacts, we just work with the museum to collect the artifacts. So I sort of feel like I'm cheating sometimes when we get those collections, because it's really not a problem for us. But I understand that would be a real challenge for other organizations.
Sure. No, you hit on something that I think is a cross section of MotorCities membership, is that we do have both of those, and they do run into that exact issue where we've got museums who are all of a sudden needing to keep archives of things and deal with issues. We provided grants over the years for things like climate control, and then those are critical. And we actually have a question from Richard Michael. It says, what about rare books and documents that require humidity control? Now, you may talk about this a little later on, or I'm not sure if this is something that to be addressed here in this appraisal section, but maybe it's one of those questions of whether you should accept things that you knowingly don't have maybe the capacity physically to house.
I mean, I think that's part of that collecting policy, is that you really have to define the parameters of what you're able to collect. If someone came to us with, I don't know, someone came to us with an architectural collection that was already in flat storage and was 20 map cases, I wouldn't be able to take it. Even if it was in scope, because there's two parts to that. Does it fit your collecting policy in intellectual scope, and does it fit in your collecting policy in physical scope? And in that instance, I just wouldn't have the physical capacity to take that sort of collection. So it's just something to keep in mind, and that's why you review your collecting policy, because people's capacity fluctuates and changes.
Sure. Okay, yeah. So those are the questions I think that tied into that section. So if there aren't any others, we will let Mark continue to move forward. But keep in mind that when he stops at the end of each one of these sections, you can raise your hand, unmute yourself, and chime in if you've got a direct question to ask, or you could also use the chat. So feel free. So go ahead, Mark.
Okay. So the last part of appraisal and collecting, we talked about collecting policy, appraisal, and then you have that physical action of accessioning or transferring the ownership of a collection into your organization. And just like with the collecting policy needing a hard copy written statement, through our Save Michigan History program, we have found a wide array of how people do this. And so I would just want to go through and document how we do it and how we feel it should be done at a basic level, just to protect your organization, because you are talking about transferring legal ownership of records. Okay. So I've really broken it up into two parts: the intellectual accessioning. So we use deposit agreements. We use deeds of gift for transferring ownership of materials. Deposit agreements is basically, an agreement that you would just have if you were storing it somewhere, you'd have a depository agreement. We do not recommend, for obvious reasons, taking collections in on loans or deposit agreements. I realize sometimes this is unavoidable, and again, it's done to preserve collections, but I just feel like there's a lot of inherent issues with those. So whenever possible, if you can execute a deed of gift for the collection, that's what we would suggest you do. And I think I encourage people, as we have been, to be creative, because sometimes people just want to give it to you because it's a relief to them to get it into an institution that will preserve it and provide access to it. And sometimes you need to have a few stipulations to get them to make that decision. And you need to be careful there, because you don't want to handcuff your organization or have too many stipulations that someone's going to forget about it and get you tripped up. And then the other thing we always do is a temporary receipt so that we can track the physical location of a collection from the time one of our archivists goes out into the field to pick it up. So I'm going to show you a screenshot here. This is our temporary receipt. So for instance, if I received a phone call, that person, Jane Doe wanted me to come and pick up their family's collection, and we agreed it fit our collecting scope and all the things we've already talked about have fit, and we go to physically pick it up. This document is filled out upon arrival at their doorstep. And this is not the deed of gift. This is not a depository agreement. It is literally what it says, a temporary receipt showing that the owner intends to donate this to the archives. We list everything that is there. And then we have a few items down at the bottom. Hopefully the screen's big enough that everyone can see this. And because this is an important part, is the box that says owner's options if materials are not accepted. Owner can either pick them up, or archives will return to the owner, or archives may dispose in any manner. So usually when we execute this temporary receipt, we have a pretty good idea that we are going to accept the collection, but we can't say 100% until our review committee votes on it and accepts it. So theoretically, that owner will pick up if we don't accept it isn't used very often, because I'm not going to expend time and energy to go pick something up if we're not going to accept it. But the other two are important, because as we process a collection, there may be some of those examples of non-records that we already talked about. And we want to make sure we are transparent and in good communication with the donor so that they know or have an option to do whatever they want. So for example, if they donate 100 postcards and we find out we already have 75 of them in the collection, they may want those postcards back. So they would check that box. Or they may say we may dispose in any manner, in which case we would then try to rehome those duplicates. So it's a lot of work and responsibility, but when you're dealing with people's family heirlooms or personal records, it's really important to build trust. And so I think having this receipt is super important. It also is a really practical aspect that they know that you're physically taking care of those records until the deed of gift is executed. So that means assigning it in a particular location. So if they call and want to look at it, your staff knows right where it is. And I realize for really small, shops where there's 2 or 3 people, that might not be necessary. For our organization where we have tens of thousands of cubic feet of records, if someone goes out and picks up a collection, they better put down a location. Otherwise, we're not going to find it. So.
Mark, you mentioned about people being able to see. I'm not sure if you've got the function on your PowerPoint where you could do a quick zoom in on it while you have the slide up. Some of them do and some of them don't, but if not, maybe we can get a sample of that out to people if you wanted to show them more.
Yeah, you can't see it that well.
No, I mean, especially the section when you said down at the bottom and weren't sure if you can see it. If you could zoom in on it, but if not, then we'll find maybe another way to deliver it to folks.
Okay, well, in the interest of not ruining the let me see here.
I think you answered my question. I was going to ask about sample templates available for various things.
Oh yeah, so I can provide this template, and this is our deed of gift template that we can provide as well. And this the language on here obviously is not a one-to-one correlation to others organizations, because we cite compiled laws that establish the legal authority of the archives, but you're more than welcome to crib the language off of this to suit the needs of your organization and the format for that matter. Change the header, use the same text and layout. We're happy to share this. And so this is the actual deed of gift that we maintain for every private collection that is accessioned by the archives. All the state and local government records use something called a direct transfer form. It's a very official governmental form that's tied to record schedules. So it's not relevant to our discussion today. That's why I'm just showing you our deed of gift for private records. We also use this for oral histories as well. Anything that comes from a private citizen into the archives has a deed of gift form. And the important elements obviously is the donor contact information and their signature, but also we record the collection number on this as well and the collection name. And our template, our base template, transfers all intellectual, physical and intellectual property rights. There really aren't any access restrictions unless it's prohibited by an existing law or unless we negotiate it separately with the donor. So an example of that is we have in Michigan, elected officials are able to decide which of their papers are private and which are public, which again, whole nother session on that. But recently what that's meant is we've had some Supreme Court justices donate their records to the archives, but they can stipulate a closure period for those records per our enabling legislation. So that's not on this form. And so we have a separate attachment to this form. So I'm just saying, we try to keep it simple. When necessary, we have addendums to this form. Okay. So that is the legal or the intellectual accessioning of the records. And then there's the obvious physical accessioning, making sure you know where you're going to store it, and document that collection in a database or with worksheets. And that goes along with accessioning. If you don't have it, again, Save Michigan History can work with you to develop it, but some sort of accessioning tool, whether it's Past Perfect or a spreadsheet that just has a control number for each collection, a description of what it is, a date range, and a physical location. And I think I really want to stress that, making that physical location part of that, that database. Okay, so that wraps up all of our the collecting and accessioning. Do you have any questions on that moving forward? Trying to watch our time here. We're moving along okay.
Yeah, no, we have a really important question. I think it's all great information, so we appreciate the time that you're spending with all of us. But we have an important question from Heidi. It says, when someone donates something, is it our responsibility, as in the recipient, the institution, is it their responsibility to determine the value of that donation? Now, I've received a separate response about that, which indicates that for tax-exempt donations, the IRS, in fact, forbids the institution from appraising it, and it is, in fact, the responsibility of the donor. So I didn't want you to address that publicly.
Yeah, we never provide that information. That is in our legal opinion, it's the responsibility of the donor. When really pressed by people, I have just referred them to the tax code. You can make a charitable contribution. I think it's probably changed, but in the past it was up to $1,500 without documentation, and that number may have changed. So you'd want to have your legal folks check that out. That is one option to give people when they really just, and I'm sure everybody here has had it, they just really pressed you or made it a precondition of donating it. You know, like, I'll donate this if you tell me how much it's worth so I can write it off in my taxes. I think everyone needs to practice and develop that response where we give the donor options without making that a precondition of them donating it. I mean, you providing the appraisal. So, and I would never suggest swapping paying for an appraisal by an independent party as a precondition of donating. I think that just opens a Pandora's box. But short answer is donor's responsibility.
Right. He even noted, thank you, Roger, noted the IRS Form 8283 for those who are interested in that. I think a lot of us here, operating in the auto world, I'm assuming a lot of these donations are, in some cases, an entire vehicle, or if not parts of a vehicle, some of physical artifacts like that. And even MotorCities has been engaged in something where someone wanted to donate, and it was in fact their responsibility to find a private appraisal before we got to that point. So I would say that that sort of corroborates what we thought. This question is it's about accessioning, but you may get to this later on as well. The question from Brian Baker asked about the nuances of oral histories or recordings. So not a physical thing, but oral history or recording, and how to record deed of gift or things like that. Is there a way to be done orally? What do you do when you need to record it?
So my very last slide talks about what we're doing with oral history, but for now, we've tried to not treat oral histories any different than if it was a diary, using that same one pager, and treating it the same way. I think the difference with oral history probably comes with the quote unquote appraisal, because I would say we're far more wide open when it comes to oral history than we would be with collecting other primary documents. But we'll wrap up with that. That's a good segue for the very last slide. But that's a good question for sure. Okay, moving on. Arrangement and description. This is one of our processing archivists, Bob Garrett, just giving you a little view into our processing area, where, like I usually say, this is where we make the sausage. So you can see a box that came in is the brown box in this picture. It's just dumped with stuff, and he's organizing it into a nice acid-free archival box. And that's really the essence of arrangement and description is making order out of chaos. Sometimes stuff comes to us completely organized, and we really don't have to do anything. In fact, there's a real movement in the last 10, 15 years in the archives world to not put everything in archival boxes or folders if you have good temperature and humidity storage. So our storage areas are 66 degrees and about 40 to 45% humidity, and it's stable and it's checked all the time. Even when we're not in the building now, I get calls from facilities if like this past week our humidity rose by, I think, about 8%. So I got a phone call. So they really monitor it quite closely. And in, I don't know, it's probably 10, 15 years ago, there was an article written called More Product, Less Process. And one of the main arguments was, why would you refolder records that are kept in storage like that? Because it's been proven that it really doesn't make that much difference. When I first started the archives 20 plus years ago, we would go through and remove staples from every piece of paper. Well, and the idea there was, well, staples rust and that can damage the paper. Well, they don't rust when it's 66 degrees and 45% humidity. They actually do nothing. So we've stopped that. We really changed how we process. And I think that's an important practical consideration when you're talking about organizations that have tight resources and need to do a lot with a little, is to think strategically about how you store your materials. This slide really, though, is the overarching concepts of arrangement and description for archives. We don't go down to the item level. We go down to what's called the series level. So, and I know that the tendency is to want to describe stuff to the item level, but we always purport that that's part of the joy of discovery for the researcher. So if we have, I'm making up examples now, but say we have a collection of photographs and there's 100,000 photographs, and there's a section on photographs of automobile advertising, and there's a section of photographs on product shots, and then there's a section on I don't know, maintenance. I'm trying to do a relevant example here. We would describe those different sections, and break it down that way, as opposed to trying to describe every single photograph. And that's really how we look at collections. Is if they're really small, we just treat it as a collection level. Someone donates a Civil War diary, that's all it is. It's a collection of a Civil War diary. And if it's a larger one, then we break it down into series. And those series is the lowest level we typically go. Hopefully that it's really, I don't know, theoretical description of how we do it. And I should have baked in an example here, but hopefully people can understand that concept. Some things to consider with arrangement description are things like who's the creator, is there an original order? You know, we don't reorganize records if there's an inherent order. If the Department of Natural Resources sends us reports from the Wildlife Division and they're organized alphabetically by species and that's how they use them and it's usable, we just let it be. We don't really touch it. And we don't, you know, if they're in presentable boxes, we don't even rebox them at this point. We just write up a guide, which we'll get to in a moment. Is it big enough that there are already series present? You're really looking at what arrangement are the records in or not in, and what do they describe? All of this is geared towards making it obvious for the researcher to access these records. Obvious and easy. This is probably the most important aspect of arrangement description, are the descriptive tools that you can create or use. So there's a couple different levels. One is the catalog level. We are part of we partner with the Library of Michigan and Michigan State University, so that when we catalog a collection, that record is actually stored in the same database as the entire MSU library system, including the Library of Michigan. So if someone's doing a keyword search there, they're going to find it. If they do a keyword search at worldcat.org, they're going to find it. They'll get collection level information. And that includes basic information such as the title, inclusive dates, a brief description, and the collection number. And I'll show you an example here in the next slide. Sometimes the catalog entry is the only descriptive tool that we use. Again, I use that example of the diary or a photo album. Sometimes that collection description is the only thing that's needed because it is what it is. It's just one thing, and there's no reason to do a collection description and a finding aid. And so that last bullet, the finding aid, is a more in-depth description of the collection. And I think maybe it's probably better if I just show you examples here instead of talking about them. So this is a sample catalog record, and you can hopefully, I know it's not blown up, but the collection title is up at the top with the author, which is sometimes just the donor. And it has the collection number and then a brief description of the collection, and that's it. That is our descriptive tool for that collection. Alternately, if it's a larger collection, we would have a catalog record like this, and then a finding aid. And the finding aid is really two parts. It's a tabled guide that goes box by box, saying what's in each of the boxes. Again, not item level, but within a series, it'll say, here are the different topics within a box, and an inclusive date range. And then we also have the part of the guide that talks about the history of the materials, called the scope and content note. It gives you background on the materials. If it was multiple series, there would be a series description on this part of the record as well. So those are our two descriptive guides. This is what you would find, and if you went to MSU Library's webpage, or answercat.org, which is the Library of Michigan and the archives page, and you did a search on Michigan Art Deco, you would find this catalog record there. So that's out in the public. And then usually this guide, we've been working on it for years, usually this guide, if there is one for the collection, I'm going to go back one slide again. Usually there would be a link right here at the collection or call number to that guide. So you sort of get both of them in one shot there. Okay, let's keep moving here. Preservation. Let's just go over some basics of preservation. Handle the records as little as possible. Always return records to secure storage when you're not working on them. I know sometimes it's, people like to keep stuff on hold. We're really not. We like to get it back to its original shelf location, even if they're coming back the next day. Obviously, don't use pens, pencils only. Keep everything clean. Use archival quality supplies whenever possible. I think that's, the qualifier there is that depending on your storage, I think is a qualifier for that. And understand the different needs of different types of materials. If you're mostly artifacts and only a little bit archival material, obviously your environmental conditions are going to be different, and artifacts probably like it a little more humid and a little more warm than what archives do. So just consider the different needs of your material. Handling archival materials, and I think a lot of times this is common sense, but even when you're in a rush, transport the material on a cart. Don't carry it by hand, because if you trip, you're going to damage the materials. Good support when you're moving them. A lot of times we have to gently remind researchers, sorry, I'm click happy today. We have to remind researchers not to put their notes on top of the volume that they're researching. They get really into their research, and you just need to not write on top of that. Don't be careful of using things like Scotch tape, or I've seen people use electrical tape. Again, if you're not sure what to use, either connect with MMA or Save Michigan History. We have lots of resources to help advise people on proper materials to use. Gloves, I've been called out by people when they've seen me handling documents without gloves, and I really only use gloves when I'm handling photographs or negatives. And with paper, I think we could have a long debate about the value of especially cotton gloves versus no gloves. I feel like there's more of a risk of damaging a page turning it with a cotton glove on. And I know a lot of museums have really moved to using nitrile-based gloves because they don't have the latex allergy issues. To me, then there's a cost benefit there as well. I don't think you're really gaining that much using a nitrile glove with a paper document versus the cost and the waste that's being created, but that might be a debate for another time. Some storage basics: avoid storing in attics or basements, and keep records in a secure locked area. Minimize light exposure. And another big one is long-term. Avoid wood shelving whenever possible. We use steel shelves that have baked enamel steel coating on them. I mean, you can be creative in sourcing that stuff. I've found it at surplus auctions. I've found it at, locally here, the state does surplus auctions, and you'll find shelving there. Michigan State University has surplus, and hopefully, a university in your area might have a surplus store. So a lot of times you can pick up that stuff on the cheap. Don't store chemicals, obviously, in your storage area. Another big one is food and drink. Everyone wants to bring their coffee in to do research, and you have to have that part of your policies to not allow that. And that includes staff. I think sometimes you have a work area for a staff person next to your research area, and it's just something to really think about. If you have a policy of no food or drink for the researcher, but you have a staff person sitting 10 feet away in their cube having lunch, how does that look? I've mentioned some of the environmentals before. These are ideals, understanding not everybody can achieve them. Like I said, we shoot for around 66%, 40 or 66 degrees, 40 to 45% humidity. It's important to keep everything off the floor, out from under overhead pipes, do regular checks of smoke detectors and fire extinguishers, and checking locks. I know a lot of these are just, they might seem redundant, but I think it's always good to have a refresher on them, to be reminded of what's the baseline for keeping archival records. And if you've been forced to cut corners, really rethink of how you can mitigate some of the risks that are present if you're not doing any of these things. Disaster planning. Now, you're going to have some follow-ups with people that have more experience in the deep dive of disaster planning or emergency response. But I think I can speak from experience and from helping some local governments deal with disasters, of some simple practical steps that you can start today if you haven't already. And those are listed here. Identify hazards in your area. Are you near a waterway? Are you in a floodplain? I mean, Houghton County, Michigan had their courthouse get flooded. If you've ever been to Houghton County, or if I have anybody here from Houghton County, to me, that seems like if I had to lay a bet of what's the least likely place in Michigan to flood, I would have put Houghton County at the top of my list. And they had a flood. So you need to have a plan. They didn't have a plan because they didn't think they were at risk. So consider all those possibilities. Prioritize your collections for disaster response. No one wants to pick favorites, but I'm sure you all, if you were forced to prioritize your collections, you could do it. I'm sure you could. I can. We maintain the constitutions for the state of Michigan. Those would be the first things I'd say. Prepare a disaster response plan. That sounds like a huge job. It is, but there are ways to do it in chunks. And that next bullet that I have here, the pocket response plan, I can share this it's a Word document that I can share with Brian, and he can send it out to anyone that attended. It's a Word document that you can fill in. And it has things like, first responder information, action steps, and you just carry it in your wallet or your briefcase or wherever. Put a copy on your phone, but also have a physical copy in case, your battery runs out like mine always does. I'll share that out. It's a real simple first step that you and your organization can take, even if you don't fill out the entire thing. I mean, don't look at it and think, oh gosh, this is going to take forever. Fill it out in steps. Having part of this filled out as opposed to all of it is going to be better than having nothing. Couple more sections here. We want to talk about reference or access, and then digitization, and then we can open it up for some questions at the end. There is no point, and I make this point all the time, there's no point to preserving records or artifacts if you're not going to provide reference or access to them. So whether that's through a research room or whether that is through an exhibition, preservation and access go hand in hand. Some of the things you want to consider with access is having written policies for how you want to run your research room if you have one. And it's important to have that because it's hard to enforce a rule that you don't have written down. And it's important to protect those materials. So some of the things that we include in our research area are no bags, coats, or pens, no enclosures for theft reasons. We register our users, and this has evolved over time, and we're to the point now where we issue a photo ID for our researchers. You provide ID, and then we issue a scannable photo ID card right at our registration desk. You don't need to go to those lengths, but I think what we did in the past is had people fill out a rules form and didn't even have them verify who they were. So I think at the very least, asking for some sort of ID to register them as a researcher is important. You need to have a policy on researchers using personal devices for making copies. Again, a few years ago, we were pretty restrictive on allowing people to take images with phones or iPads or scanners, and we've really opened that up. For a while, and we still do, we provided iPads with copy stands. We still offer those, but because technology advances so quickly, we just can't keep up with it. And so as long as someone isn't going to come in and copy an entire photo collection, we are pretty liberal with the use of bring your own device. Our parameters are, though, you just can't copy entire collections because those are still the responsibility of the organization. We don't have a public photocopier for original materials, and we do sometimes have the need for someone that wants a paper copy, but we have staff help them do that. So you'll have to consider if you have the resources or capacity to do that for researchers. This is another tough one, is just having a physical space to register researchers. Before we moved into the current building that the archives is in 1989, the archives was in a really small, cramped public health building out in North Lansing, and the research room and the registration area and the staff desks were all crammed together. And so there really wasn't a place to register a researcher. If you have that challenge, you need to be creative on how to do that. And registering researchers, whenever possible, should be in a separate area just to minimize the distraction to researchers that are already there. Have a place for people to leave their personal belongings. Again, surplus auctions or surplus places like MSU, etc., are a great place for lockers on the cheap. And then having a desk space that has the adequate surface area so that you can see everything that's being used. I think I've explained this on in-person tours of the archives. All of these rules and regs are only meant to guarantee that the materials are available to the next researcher so that they're there indefinitely. If you have archives material in your collection, unfortunately, your job is to plan for forever, which is a little daunting. And so you really have to balance being secure and being hospitable and helpful. And so that's just a challenge to flag, that you don't want to create a police state in your organization, but you really do need to develop guidelines to safeguard your materials while maintaining, a personable and helpful research environment. And lastly, for research or reference and access, is to conduct that initial reference interview. Talk to them, talk to the researcher, find out what they want, do it in advance if at all possible, and get them to the materials that they need, that they want to see quickly. Practice listening, ask follow-up questions, and avoid jargon if at all possible. And the last bullet here, if you don't have capacity to do a lot of this, consider charging a fee. There are certain things at the Archives of Michigan that we just cannot do for free, and we charge a fee. And frankly, people pay for it willingly because if they're in another state or if they're 4 hours away, it's better to pay $20 research fee and get the stuff emailed to you than not have access to it at all. So there's no harm in charging a fee, even for a research service. And then lastly, we can talk about digitization. This should be a session all on its own. And I think I'm going to summarize digitization of archival records with the following. Can you justify the time and cost to digitize records? Digitizing is not preserving. It's not preserving if you do not have a plan for the electronic records that you're creating. If you're scanning a book like the one that's pictured here, and then you are storing it on the hard drive of a computer somewhere, you've really gained not a whole lot. So you need to have a plan, and you need to look at partnerships. I know, at least until recently, the University of Michigan was still partnering with smaller organizations to host online material. Don't try to do this all yourself. Reach out to us at Save Michigan History, and we can help try to link you up with other partners, but really think long and hard about why you're digitizing something. And then once you do that, there's all sorts of considerations to consider. Let me just go on to my next slide here, such as things like, what are the standards that you're going to use for things like metadata? And if you're not familiar with the term metadata, that's just the description, the subfields that you see on any digital record. It might say what the file name is and when it was created. It's all those things that can be searched by a computer system. What equipment are you going to use? Do you have staff to see the project through to the end? So many scanning projects have started and never been completed. And then documenting your decisions, and so that you don't have what we call digital debt. We really want to encourage people to think out the project from A to Z before they begin, so that it doesn't get halfway through and we just become a bunch of, I'll throw myself into this. How many of you out there have digitized material sitting somewhere on a hard drive or a server or something that you need to do something with right now? I do. I wish I didn't, but I do. So don't start another project until you've dealt with those. And then finally, what are the standards you're going to use for your scanning? We can follow all sorts of different standards, but at the Archives of Michigan, we follow the National Archives scanning standards. So you can see some elements of those here. We're always happy to share those when people ask, but we use TIFF, uncompressed TIFF files, depending on the size of the original, anywhere from 300 to 600 DPI, and then we use JPEG or PDF for access copies. So our master files are TIFFs. If we need to send them out to somebody for reference, we reformat them so we're not sending out huge files. And then typically we don't keep those access copies. We just get rid of them unless it's something that's requested, on a regular basis. And then lastly, I referred to the fact we wanted to talk about oral history at the end. We have been partnering with StoryCorps for about 2.5 years. And this goes back to our discussion on, it actually covers a lot of different components that we've talked about as far as appraisal or collecting scope and the deed of gift. So with StoryCorps, we really folded into the Michigan History Center's desire to collect more diverse stories from people in Michigan. And so it's really been, just like StoryCorps is wide open, our collecting project with StoryCorps is wide open. So literally anyone can come to us and say they want to record a StoryCorps interview with us, and a copy goes to StoryCorps, a copy comes to the Archives of Michigan, and literally you can talk about anything you want. We don't, with oral histories, we're not going to try to predetermine whose story is important, because we feel everyone's story is important. So that's a real divergence for us. I think in the past, traditionally, institutions would just collect oral histories of, leaders of industry or the governor or senators or whatever. But we have made a real shift with oral histories to open it up completely, unilaterally. We wouldn't do that nor could we do that with paper documents, primary resources. So I feel like rather than looking at it as an inconsistency, I look at it as a democratization of how we can collect people's information and stories. So that is my last slide. I know I sort of hurried up there at the end, but I wanted to stay on. I wanted to stay on time and have a few minutes for questions if anybody has some.
Wow. Yeah. No. Thanks, Mark. And we do have some stockpiled up that some you kind of addressed as you went along. So you did a good job of dealing with some of the questions that would have come up because some of the main questions had to do with which I think you addressed earlier on. What is the current access of the archive? You explained, but maybe a quick recap of that, of the fact that people can contact you, but you're not open for
Sure.
Visitation in the reading room at this time. I think it's all remote. Someone asked a question about the use of the use fees for images.
Oh yeah, I knew we had pinned that one. So going back to the original question, we've put a request in to be open by appointment, but that has pretty much been put on hold because of the governor's remote working extension into January. So we're still hopeful. We put that request in back in June, and we keep reminding them that we want to be able to be open by appointment. We have all of the Plex barriers and precautions in place, so we're ready to go. We're just waiting for approval on that. In the meantime, you can email us at archives@michigan.gov with a question. You can email us to sign up for a virtual interview, not interview, but consultation is probably the better word. So you can do a one-on-one discussion with any of our reference archivists. And then sometimes a request, a real popular request are naturalization records in our collection. Because of how those are stored, that's a fee-based request. So again, if you just email the archives@michigan.gov, they'll be able to direct you into which way to go for your request. So it'll either be answered right away. We'll either set up an interview through Zoom, or we'll send you a link to do a pay for research. Now, to the question about schedule of fees for reproductions, it's the Wild West out there. Everybody has their own schedule. We do too. And I think it's, I wish we had the ability in the budget like the Library of Congress does to just say, it's all free, right? Just use it. The important thing here is to use it. And I know sometimes people have criticized us and other institutions that charge reproduction fees, that we should just be offering it for free. The problem is that we have minimal budget, just like probably everyone else here. And so if you can figure out a way to recoup some revenue, you need to do that. My suggestion though is to keep it simple, keep it affordable, and keep it simple. So have exceptions for nonprofits, have exceptions for using it on the web with citation, have exceptions for students. I'm not going to charge a student to use one of our images in his, especially now, right? Because everyone's doing stuff online. We're not going to charge him to use an image online. And that's, frankly, candidly, that's if they even ask us to use it. So, and we don't go out and police the use of our images. It's an honor system for sure. So I hope that answers the question. I mean, the other way that we have tried to take the sting out of charging for reproduction, like use fees, is we have really flipped it and just started creating merchandise from images in the collection. So I didn't mention it in my presentation, but if you go to michiganology.com, you'll see a project that we've been working on for about 10 years where we take images from the archives collection and offer stuff for sale. And so that way we've been able to sort of decrease the amount of user fees that we have because we're out selling stuff. And so I'm sure everyone's probably done promotional stuff for their organization. or maybe even sell a few things here and there, I would encourage you to do that. Like it's okay to make tote bags or t-shirts or whatever with images from your collection, because people love Michigan history, no matter what it is. And people love, MotorCities heritage history.
No, thank you. We think so. We're a lovable bunch.
Yeah.
A few more quick questions. Earlier on, you were talking about how materials are cataloged and posted and metadata. So Richard posed the question, what about the redacted materials? So you mentioned the fact that some materials can be classified as not public. Is that material completely stricken from the record, or where does that go when you post it publicly?
Sorry, I'm having a camera issue here. So let me think of, there's so many examples. So there are restricted records. I'm trying to think of a private records collection example. So,
well, you gave an example of if a Supreme Court justice said, we're turning over our papers, but certain periods of time had to be redacted, or certain things.
Yeah. So some of it is just closed for a certain period of time, and some of it might be, okay, I don't want you to share my opinion notes on this given topic. So if that material is sort of intermingled with other material that is open, then we would just redact it.
Got it.
I mean, again, so that's a consideration for your organization for capacity. Do you have the bandwidth to take in a collection that's going to require you to redact information? Because that is a time-consuming job, to redact information to make it available.
Yeah, you have to be heavily aware.
Yeah.
Marsha Harris asked a question. She said she's been interested in deaccessioning work. She said she goes to a lot of museums and colleges, and the documentation is there saying when the materials were required, but do not know what happens or what to say when things are deaccessioned. So is there such a thing? How does that work when things?
I mean, I treat deaccessioning as accessioning in reverse. We document every, we don't deaccession that much. I'm sure museums do it more, but you have to document every step so that you can say what was done with the material. And I know historically, even our museum probably hasn't done the best job of that, but I think it's important to address it now. If there isn't a policy in place to document that step, there needs to be one.
Right. Some questions about some technical stuff about the glove. So you brought up the fact that you were leaning into the glove conversation and saying what you use them for, but then the question was, what about cotton gloves versus, you mentioned nitrile or other.
Yeah, so like I use cotton gloves. Okay, well, let me step back. I use gloves for photos and negatives for the most part. And if I'm going to wear gloves for those, I'm going to wear cotton. Mostly it's a personal choice because I don't like nitrile gloves. I don't like my hands getting clammy and sweaty. And so that's just a personal choice. I don't know. I'm not aware of a scientific argument of one over the other for photos and negatives. I don't think there is. But I was just saying that I've seen, especially in our museum, the use of the nitrile gloves in handling artifacts, which I can see the value of that because it gives you a better grip. Your hand oils aren't in contact with the artifact, etc. I don't wear cotton gloves when handling volumes or other paper because I feel like it can catch on corners and damage the paper. And so I just don't wear gloves when I'm handling records because I don't think the amount of touching that I'm doing with my clean hands on that paper is amounting to much damage. And I, again, from that balance in the research room of keeping things secure and safe, but also having a inviting and hospitable environment, I don't see the value in having a researcher use nitrile gloves to go through folder after folder of paper records. So I think it's a choice. I'm just telling you what we do. people probably have other reasons of why they should or shouldn't. I think that's just an institutional organizational decision that you should make and say why.
Sure, sure. Marcia, I see your hand up, so I'm not sure if you want to have a follow-up question. She's the one that posed the question about the deaccessioning. So I don't know if you have a follow-up question or if that's an errant hand, but we're happy to answer it if you can unmute.
I just wanted to know that, like, when people donate stuff to colleges, they just think, okay, the college is going to keep it there and let people use it. But then when the person goes to try to use it, they say we're not allowed to use it because they didn't get permission when they donated it. So now when people I know are donating things, I want to make sure I tell them, make sure you say it's open. Is there a form that says that it's open for people to look at? Because like you said, if it's no good, if it just sits in the special collections in the library and you can't access it.
That's why that, Marcia, that's why that deed of gift is so important.
Okay, that's what I thought.
That's why that deed of gift is that you should not take anything in, and you shouldn't donate something anywhere unless you get a deed of gift back that you're signing, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a great follow-up question. All right, so we posed some great questions. You've answered a lot. I'm going to ask one more before we get out of here, and that it has to do, maybe this is too broad a topic, this is another conversation, but as we've transitioned and we're talking about digital, and you touched on this before about people digitizing and moving things over, do you have a sort of standard as to how that goes? So what if someone shows up and says, I've already scanned all of these images, so we don't want to give you the originals, we want to give you this stack of discs that, you know, have the entire collection on it. Are you saying, hey,
Never happened.
Well, it already happened. So how hard are you laughing? I mean, what is the response to that?
I think the answer is it depends. I mean, if it depends for a number of reasons. It depends on the quality of the scans. So if they were digitized 15 years ago and everything's pixelated and not great quality, and the original still exist, I'm not sure I would take it. If the quality is good enough and you have a good case to make about, you know, it being able to share it online with people to improve access, that might be a factor that would tip you into taking it. And then the third is, are they going to sign off permission? You know, are they going to sign off rights to that content? And even if they do, does that free you to use it even though the original still exists? So I think it's something to think about carefully, and think about, you know, I've found in those situations in the past, it's good just to start the discussion and not say yes or no right away. Because a lot of times a donor, after you talk with them about it and you build some trust, they realize, you know what, you actually have better storage conditions than I do. And it almost reverses, like they keep a copy of the digital and then the originals come into the institution. I think it depends, and it's an opportunity to build trust with a potential donor, I think.
Oh.
But if they're poor quality and, you know, if they're a bunch of JPEGs or PNG files that are 5 kilobytes each, you're probably going to want to say no.
Got it. I was just thinking about, again, the purveyance of the digital materials now, even from the media side of things. You know, in the automotive industry, new automobile materials are coming out, and when the media gets press kits about a new automobile being launched, they're getting a thumb drive or they're getting a link to download the copy. So yeah. The idea of archiving a catalog or a book or a magazine is not the same as, you know, what they're receiving now. So that primary source has changed now.
Yeah, as I was talking today, I realized my audience here, and it's a whole different ballgame with things like manuals or promotional literature, or so that it's really cut and dry for us a lot of times, and I realize it's not for most of the people on this call today. So
yeah, so it's a case-by-case thing, which
yeah.
So and they know who to consult for those cases. So Mark, we thank you for sharing with us and giving us your time. We put the archives at michigan.gov, and we're going to also share some more materials from the presentation with the group. So thank you for joining us. And I am going to share just a few slides. Again, reminder of next week's presentation. We'll be back to kind of continue this series. Mark has set the stage. We'll talk about rising to the challenge when disaster strikes and what to do with Mary from the Henry Ford. And the final one will be sort of true disaster management with John from Belfort Property Restoration. And we talk about things that won't happen, can't happen, shouldn't happen, and then they do happen, even as Mark explained with the Holton example. But we know even recently, Mid-Michigan went with a devastating flood, and there were museums and archives and collections baked into that, and how they responded to that. So we'll continue that series through the end of the month. Just a reminder of how to stay in touch with Motor Cities, even presentations like this one. Check out our website, check out our social media, particularly our YouTube channel will host this presentation, all of our Motor Cities at Homes and Lunch and Learn. So while we're all still where we are, we can kind of still share together with all this content. So with that being said, we appreciate you all joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next week with Mary from the Henry Ford and the week after that. So have a good afternoon, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.